Hi, everybody. Due to the current situation in our country, the prevailing situation of our country, we won't be able to meet and have our regular interactions. So I think it's important to use technology as much as possible to complete at least few um, lectures during these few weeks that we won't be able to meet. So Slim took this initiative of doing few video snippets that will be useful. You can learn from home, and if you have any issues, you can always reach out to me or any of your lecturers and get feedback. So I'm moving into chapter 2 today because if you guys can remember last week or week before when we met, um, I told you that I'm jumping into market entry methods because it was important. Completing market entry methods was important for your assignment. So now remember, I have briefed you on the assignment, and I have covered the theory area which is related to your assignment, which is market entry methods. And now you have all the resources to complete your assignment. So make use of these few weeks that you are home to complete your assignment, so that you don't have any backlog when we start our normal day-to-day lives. So moving on to chapter 2, if I quickly recap on chapter 2, we learnt about two important trade theories. One is the absolute advantage theory, and then we learnt about the comparative advantage theory. Absolute advantage theory is where one country can produce more of a good by using the same resources or fewer resources than another country. So in other words, you're talking about efficiency. If a country can manufacture a good more efficiently than another country, that country has absolute advantage. Then we learned that there can be countries which will have absolute advantage to manufacture uh, everything, right? And another country which has absolute disadvantage to manufacture everything. So in a situation like that, you need to look at the comparative advantage. Comparative advantage talks about the opportunity cost, right? So a country should manufacture a good for which they have the lowest opportunity cost. As long as they sacrifice less when manufacturing that good, they have low opportunity cost, and as a result they have comparative advantage. So then we learned how to calculate the comparative advantage, how to calculate the opportunity cost, and how to decide on which country needs to manufacture what, right? So those two trade theories are based on purely based on output. You're focusing on the output, right? How much you can manufacture by using fewer resources. So it's mainly based on the output that you can generate. But then Porter came up with a different theory. He said, don't just look at output, look at the competitive advantage. When you want to manufacture something, always look at the competitive advantage. So he said there are four factors that will determine this competitive advantage. He called it the diamond of national advantage, the diamond factors. So factor number one was factor conditions. So what you mean by factor conditions is factors of production, right? So if one country has superior factors of production, that country has competitive advantage to manufacture that good or service. So if you take examples, China, the superior factor conditions they have would be labor, right? When you move into Middle East, the superior factor conditions they have is oil, resources, right? Land. Then when you move into Sri Lanka, the superior factor conditions we have would be our strategic location, again, land, weather, right? So every country will have certain factors of condition, right? Factors of production which are superior than the other country. So it's important for countries to identify their factor conditions and determine their competitive advantage based on the superiority of the factor conditions they have. Then number two, he introduced this factor called demand conditions. Demand conditions relate to the sophistication of demand in the local market. Say for an example, if the local market demands for better products, manufacturers in those countries will be manufacturing better products. But if the demand conditions are poor and consumers are happy with what they're getting, then manufacturers might not be, or marketers and manufacturers will not be producing better products because consumers are not demanding. They're happy with what they get. So that is why we always bring in this comparison with the Sri Lankan consumer and the European consumer. European consumers are more environmentally conscious. They are concerned about animal rights. They're concerned about human rights. They're concerned about how their products are being manufactured. Are their products being manufactured in sweatshops? These are questions that many Western or European consumers are having. But when you move into Asia, those are not concerns of consumers, right? But now this is changing. Now, even in Asian countries, there are consumers who are concerned about the environment. They're concerned about where and how their products are being manufactured. So now the demand conditions are improving in Asia, right? So you can't always say the Western consumer, the European consumer has better demand conditions always. Now those demand conditions are shifting towards the Asian markets as well, right? So demand conditions. Now, if you take another example, when you buy a burger, especially in the West, the burger manufacturer has to say how much of calories are there in the burger, right? So consumers request for information before they buy their product. So as a result, manufacturers are also pushed to manufacture better products. So demand conditions will become an important competitive advantage. Then we have the third factor, related and supporting industries. Now, related and supporting industries relates to when there is a main industry, there has to be supporting industries around it to support the main industry. So if I give you an example, apparel industry, if apparel is a main industry, are there sufficient supporting and related industries in Sri Lanka to support the main apparel industry? But unfortunately, it's not the case, right? We have to import our yarn, we have to import our buttons, our accessories, our fabric, everything from other countries, right? So when you don't have this supporting industry base within the country, the export earnings that you earn from the main industry will go out of the country to import raw material. So in the example that I brought in, the export earnings that we gain from apparel manufacturing will drain out of the country to import raw material that is required for this apparel industry. So that's why now if you look at in US, right, the concept of Silicon Valley, when America realized and the entire world realized that the revolution, the next revolution is going to be based on technology, before going into mainstream technology, they looked at supporting industries that should enable or support this main industry. So that's why they invested on the Silicon Valley, because they realized for technology based products, you need silicon based products. So to enable that, they established the Silicon Valley so that one day when this main industry thrives, there is a supporting industry to support it. So that becomes a key competitive advantage for any country, having related and supporting industries. And finally, we are going into the fourth point, firm strategy, structure, and rivalry. Organizations in the country should have global strategies, right? Global structures and healthy rivalry. Now, this is another important competitive advantage that companies should have, right? So one is your strategy should be flexible. You need to not just look at deliberate strategy, but also look at emergent strategies that will change your course of action. And then your structures, now when you start your business, your structure is going to be more local, but when you go global, your structure needs to be global, right? So now you might be operating with a CEO. Under the CEO you will have manager marketing, manager sales, manager HR and all that. But when you become a global company, now Unilever can't operate like that. Unilever will have a president. Under the president you will have VP Asia, VP Europe, VP Middle East, likewise a more geo structure, right? And then under those geographies, under VP Asia, there will be head of marketing, head of HR, likewise, right? So it's a more regional based geo structure, geography based structure. Some organizations have global product structures, which talks about different product verticals and have different VPs to head those verticals. So your structure can't be local anymore. Your structure needs to evolve to a more global scale. And then finally, rivalry. Healthy competition has to be there. If there is monopoly, you can't create competitive advantage. There has to be rivalry so that companies will do better than their competitors. So moving on, there's a slight delay. So I have elaborated this a bit more. Now you have the traditional factors. If you can see, firm strategy, structure and rivalry, factor conditions, demand conditions, and related and supporting industries. These are the traditional factors. So if you go back again, factor conditions would be natural resources, human resources, capital resources, infrastructure, etc. Demand conditions can be the size of the domestic market and how sophisticated demand conditions are in that local market. Related and supporting industry base would be the domestic suppliers who are strong and who are supporting the main industry. And finally, you have firm strategy, structure, and rivalry, which talks about company strategy, structure, systems, and competition. Now, these are the traditional four factors that Porter spoke of. But apart from these traditional four factors, always remember government policies, industry regulations will also affect these four factors. Now, you might have all these four factors might be favorable to you. But just imagine if the government policy is not favorable to your business, if the government is not liberalizing a particular trade because of certain interests, or if the government has very socialist ideology where they don't encourage the role of business. If those are the policies that you have to deal with, then all the competitive advantage that you had will disappear due to the government action, right? So that's one aspect. The other aspect is chance. Chance relates to random events that occur. Now, last year, if you guys can remember, in April, we faced a situation due to the Easter Sunday bombings. We had all these four factors positive towards us, right? We had the location, we were attracting a lot of tourists, but unfortunately, due to this sudden event which happened, the terrorist attack, all these competitive advantage factors became disadvantages for us, right? Now you can see, due to the global pandemic of COVID-19, how that is affecting all these four factors. All these four factors are favorable, but unfortunately, a sudden natural disaster or as a pandemic, a global pandemic, can affect the competitive advantage built by companies and countries, right? So this is mainly related to a country. So always relate this to a country, and all the competitive advantages that you have built over a period of time can be wiped out due to an external factor like a terrorist attack or a natural disaster or a random event that takes place in the market. So that's about it on um on the three trade theories. Now we have learned comparative advantage, absolute advantage, and competitive advantage as trade theories. And then we are moving on to advantages of free trade. I think this is the best time to take stock of advantages of free trade. Now, they say during a global pandemic, if you stay in isolation, right? If countries maintain isolation, then you can't get out of this situation. You need to share knowledge, you need to share resources. That's when you can actually come out of a global pandemic like the coronavirus, right? So free trade and globalization will definitely enable. Now if you might ask me the question, look, isn't globalization the reason why this virus is spreading? Of course, due to globalization this virus is spreading. But if you look at decades ago in the 14th century, when there was no globalization, no planes, nothing, but still there were viruses that actually spread across the globe. So globalization will actually spread the diseases faster, but you can actually come out of situations like this due to free trade and globalization, where countries need to share their experiences, resources, and come out of it together. So free trade, the main advantages of free trade would be the countries can actually specialize in what they can produce and increase production, so that they can specialize in what they're doing and they can export their surpluses to other countries. So resources will be allocated more efficiently. You will not be producing everything, but you're producing a good where you have an advantage. And then countries can export their surpluses to other countries. You can gain economies of scale because you're not just manufacturing to your local market, you're manufacturing to the foreign markets as well. So you can gain scale advantage. Then, of course, competition from imports will break monopolies in countries and create competition. So that's another advantage of free trade. Or else, if you close the economy, the domestic players will create monopolies. But when you open the economy and allow free trade, you will see a lot of competition, which will benefit the consumer. And with trade, capital will flow into countries. Now that's another advantage. Capital poor countries will gain foreign exchange by exporting their products. Now that is another advantage of free trade, and people will come and invest in countries, right? So that will be a big advantage of free trade. And then finally, uh, free trade or trade would be the starting point of political relationships. Political links actually start with trade. So that's these are some of the advantages that you see in free trade. So uh, we all understand the importance of free trade, but you need to also remember that governments will always take protectionist measures, protectionist approach. If I ask you what these protectionist approaches are, governments would put tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers, quotas, embargoes, various restrictions, and limit imports from coming into the country. Now that's something that we have seen, even our government does it. There are limitations, there are protectionist measures being taken. That's understood. Why do governments have protectionist measures is something that we need to ask. So one main reason behind protectionist measures would be to protect local infant industries in the local market who can't compete with global firms. uh, Governments need to protect them, right? They need to protect these industries until they can stand on their own feet. So that is why we call it protection of infant industries. But unfortunately, what happens is a government protects an infant industry, and even after the infant industry grows and when they can stand on their own feet, still they request protectionist measures, right? They want protection, right? Which should not be the case, because more protectionist measures government takes, it discourages imports, right? When you discourage imports, it'll affect the consumer, because now the consumer doesn't have options. They are left with locally manufactured products. Imported products are very expensive. Imported products might be better than the locally manufactured ones, but they can't buy it because it's more expensive due to the tariff barriers enforced by the government, right? So it's important. Protection of infant industries is good, but then when these infant industries grows, you need to lift these protectionist measures and allow those infant industries to compete with global players, right? So one main reason why the government takes protectionist measures would be to protect local infant industries. Then another reason why governments take protectionist measures would be to protect against dumping. Dumping is a situation where products are dumped in certain markets at lower than the manufacturing cost. So say in China, your manufacturing cost would be $100, but then you sell the product at $150, you make all the money, and once you break even, the rest of the quantity they come and dump in a developing country at $80 or $50. Now that is actually lower than the manufacturing cost of that product, right? Now, when that happens, you go and dump products at lower prices, then the local manufacturer gets affected because there are many products in the market at lower prices. So then the local manufacturers will have to reduce the prices. And then another reason, the third reason why governments take protectionist measures would be to increase employment. Because if you import all the products into the country, you're not manufacturing anything. So manufacturing will only allow employment. So to increase employment, there will be restrictions put forward to imported products. Then of course, for national security, there are certain restrictions being put. You can't import drugs, you can't import medicine, weapons into the country. You need to obtain certain approvals, right? So due to national security, there will be limitations put to import certain products. And then, of course, to improve balance of payment, to have a healthy BOP. Balance of payment is the difference between export revenue and import expenditure. So if there is a to maintain a healthy balance of payment, you have to reduce imports because imports will incur expenses, and encourage exports because exports will give you revenue. So to have a healthy balance of payment, sometimes governments would take protectionist measures. And finally, to equalize the cost of production. Say in Sri Lanka, you can manufacture a particular product at $10, but you import the same product from China at $5. Then to equalize the cost of production and to have a level playing field, the government might impose a tariff of $5 to the imported product. So then the cost of manufacturing is $5, the tariff is $5, and you bring the price, the cost of the product to $10. right? So thereby you equalize the cost of production of that imported product to the local cost of production. So these are some of the reasons why governments take protectionist measures. So these are some of the protectionist measures taken by the governments. I'll stop from this. These are methods of protection taken by governments. Now, the most common method of protection used by the government would be tariffs, right? So a tariff can be, you guys might be knowing of HS codes, right? Every product category falls into a particular HS code. So you can calculate the duty component of a particular product using the HS code, right? So based on the HS code, the government might publish a tariff saying, okay, you need to pay X amount for every 100 kilos that you import, or else it can be a percentage of the value of the goods. Whatever it is, it's a commercial value that you need to pay, a duty component that you need to pay when you import a product. Now the question is, are tariffs limited only for imports? No. There was a question in one of the papers, in one of the question papers, what are the two types of tariffs? The two types of tariffs would be import tariff and export tariff. If you have to pay a tariff when you import a product, then that's called an import tariff. If you have to pay a tariff when you export a product, that becomes an export tariff. Now, there is a difference between a tax and a tariff that you need to understand. A tax is a levy that you need to pay irrespective of whether you are importing or locally manufacturing, right? So value added tax is something that everybody has to pay, whether you import, whether you export, doesn't matter. Whether you manufacture locally, you have to pay the value added tax. Nations building tax is another tax that everybody has to pay. Income tax is withholding tax. All these are taxes, right, that we need to pay. But tariffs are levies on products that cross geographic borders. So it has to, if it's an import coming into the country, you call it an import tariff. If it is a tariff on exported products, it becomes an export tariff. So on any levy that is charged on products which are moving beyond geographic borders, we call them tariffs, right? Now, import tariff, if somebody asks you, why does a government put an import tariff? I have already given you the reasons: to protect infant industries, to create jobs, to have a healthy balance of payment, to prevent dumping. These are the main reasons why a government would enforce an import tariff. But why would a government put an export tariff? Now that's a $1 million question. Exports should be encouraged at all means. So in a situation like that, why does a government put an export tariff? Good question. Answer is, governments might not enforce export tariffs on all products. There can be certain products that are required for local consumption. Now you saw recently there was a total ban of masks, face masks being exported out of the country. Why does the government do this? To make sure that there are sufficient supplies for the local market. So sometimes for products like sugar, for products like onions, now India had a tariff, export tariff for onions. If you are exporting onions, you need to pay a lefty tariff, right? So that is to discourage exports from happening, right? So one main reason behind export tariffs would be to make sure that there are sufficient supplies for local consumption. That's number one. Number two, export tariffs are charged. Another purpose would be to keep the prices stable in the local market. If there is a shortage of goods, you export everything, there is a shortage, then the prices will rise. There would be inflation. So to avoid that, governments might enforce an export tariff. And then finally, another reason for an export tariff would be it generates government revenue. So that reason applies to both import tariffs and export tariffs. right? Import tariffs and export tariffs both would generate more government revenue. Then quotas, another interesting method of protection would be quotas. A quota is a quantitative restriction. Rather than putting a tariff, you would say you can import only X amount of apparel from these countries. So you limit or you reduce the quantity that can be imported. That is also a very effective method to reduce imports and to encourage local manufacturers. Then, of course, embargoes, as we all know, embargoes are also called sanctions, right? These are restrictions for certain countries. Say, due to human rights issues, due to political reasons, you might put a embargo against a particular country. So there are embargoes against Syria, against Iran. For oil, there are embargoes. So likewise, governments might put embargoes and restrict importing from certain countries due to political reasons mainly. Then, of course, the fourth one, voluntary export restraint, VER. Voluntary export restraint is two countries will get together and say, I will voluntarily reduce my exports going into your country, right? Say Sri Lanka would have a voluntary export restraint with India, whereas Sri Lanka will say, I will limit my tea exports to India by this amount. And India will say, I will limit my exports of onions into Sri Lanka by this amount, right? So voluntarily, the two countries will get together, and two or more countries will get together and voluntarily reduce their exports going out to other countries, right? So that again becomes an export restriction like the export tariff. And then, of course, non-tariff barriers applied through safety rules and administrative controls. Now, when you send certain goods to USA, you need to obtain Food and Drug Authority approval, FDA approval. When you import medicine into Sri Lanka, you need to obtain NMRB approval, right? National Medical Research Bureau approval needs to be sought before you import certain medicine into the country. So likewise, there are non-tariff barriers. You need to obtain certain approvals, you need to obtain certain certificates, you need to divulge country of origin certificates. Likewise, there are qualitative restrictions put, regulations put. So these regulations might limit imports from coming into the country, or else it will improve the quality of the imports that come into the country. You don't import everything, but you have some sort of restriction, whereas you control the quality of the goods that come into your country. So that's another method of protection. You call it a non-tariff barrier. Regulations, safety regulations, and administrative controls that you put even importing from other countries. And then finally, exchange control. Exchange rates can be used to limit imports. Now, as you know, when a country's currency is devalued, the biggest advantage is for exports, because now if you look at the Sri Lankan rupee depreciated from 180s to 186 recently. So when a local currency depreciates, the first thing that happens is it gives a boost to exports, and because the exported products become cheaper in the global market, but your imports become expensive. The imported products into the country become more expensive. So some countries actually use their exchange rates, or they depreciate the currency purposely to make their imported products more expensive in the local market and discourage imports and to encourage exports. Now, this is against the World Trade Organization. So if you know of the history, China started depreciating their currency. But when they became a member of the World Trade Organization in 1991, World Trade Organization said, you can't depreciate your currency. You need to have a fair, level playing field. You can't be depreciating your currency uh, and create a disadvantage to other countries by depreciating your currency. So you can, if you really want, you can depreciate your currency purposely and limit imports and encourage exports by making your exports more cheaper or more affordable in the global market. So these are few things that I uh, wanted to present in this session. So we spoke of some trade theories. I started with absolute advantage, went into comparative advantage, and then I explained you the competitive advantage theory. And then, of course, why do governments take protectionist measures? What are the protectionist measures taken by the government? So these are the few things that I wanted to highlight in this session. I'll see you again in another session like this. Thank you.